It's midday on the 2nd of August 216 BC, and the largest Roman army yet assembled has finally finished deploying for battle at Cannae. Opposite them stands the far smaller army of Hannibal Barca. What is about to transpire will go down as one of the most famed and studied battles of history. But never before has it been simulated to this level of detail. From fleshing out the unrecorded skirmishing action which occupied the bulk of the morning's action, to the messy realities of marching 70,000 infantry through obstacle-strewn farmland into the teeth of an echeloned battle line. The clashing of the cavalry across two wildly different engagements. The maneuvering of troops in each phase of the ensuing battle. And the final envelopment of the Roman army in what would prove to be one of the single bloodiest days of battle in history. We bring it all to life from both a bird's-eye perspective and the boots on the ground. This is the climactic conclusion of the Battle of Cannae.
Now in this series, we've been trying to bring the Battle of Cannae to life. This relies largely on written records, and I really wish we could find some archaeology, but unfortunately a lot of it is lacking for this particular battle. But one place where archaeology doesn't seem to be lacking is up in England, where they trip over all sorts of Roman finds. This story in particular caught my eye about massive footed Roman garrisons up in Northumberland that has a lot of archaeologists scratching their heads. I found this story thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that empowers you to be a properly informed consumer of the news. Each day they pull in thousands of articles from around the world and organize them by story in one place. And for each story, you'll get a visual breakdown of the political biases, reliability, and ownership. So let's return now to our story of extraordinarily large Roman shoes. What is great about Ground News, as you can see here, is I get a good summary of how this news story is being treated in the media ecosphere. So here's the bias distribution, left, right, and center, where they lean. I can also see the factuality ratings and ownership. All this is relevant to me because I can potentially spot landmines of misinformation or disinformation, or even just biases inherent in those sources. If I want to learn more about what maybe different sides are saying, even just skim headlines, I can go left, right, and center. For instance, in the left, I see a bunch of sources. One of them is being a bit more clickbaity. They're saying, hey, Roman big feet, what's going on here? Not giving me much information. If I go, meanwhile, on the right, I do find actually a pretty good source here that talks about, it's actually 8 shoes. They're giving me specific measurements. There's more details, equivalent size 49, which is insane about this story. And if I go back to the center, I get even my own recap of this information. So this is all really useful. I get my synthesis of the information, and then I get a lot of tools in my tool belt if I want to dive deeper into any of these particular articles. My other favorite feature from Ground News is the blind spot feed, which shows you stories which might be covered disproportionately by one side or the other. I honestly love Ground News and think they've created one of the best platforms out there in our modern age of disinformation, so definitely check it out. Head on over to ground.news/Invicta or scan the QR code on screen to transform how you read the news and get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan. That's ground.news/Invicta.
On the 2nd of August 216 BC, a red vexillum waved outside the tent of Consul Gaius Terentius Varro. After days of posturing across the plains of Cannae, it was finally time for battle. But even such a simple matter would take hours for the tens of thousands of troops to be led out of their camps and onto the battlefield. As both armies deployed for battle, their 3-kilometer fronts were screened by a mass of skirmishers numbering some 28,000 troops in total. An incredible host in its own right, whose assembled ranks would have dwarfed most battles of the medieval era. On the Roman side came the 20,000 velites, a class of young, poor levies equipped with simple javelins, small shields, and animal skin caps. Unlike the heavy infantry, they do not appear to have adopted any rigid formation or been accompanied by any formal officer rank. Thus, they deployed as a loose swarm with relative autonomy over their area of the battlefield. However, it is likely that some guidance was needed to coordinate their actions. Thus, we have assumed that the bands of velites remain relatively close to their parent maniples. This would have given them several hundred meters worth of buffer. Enough separation to perform screening actions, but close enough to fall back to the bastion of heavy infantry if pressed too heavily. Bridging this gap will likely have been runners or mounted messengers meant to maintain some level of coordination between the two groups. These presumably prowled the rear lines of the velites, keeping tabs on their ranks and peering over their heads in an attempt to glean some sense of the enemy's disposition. Opposite them stand their Carthaginian counterparts. At just 8,000 strong, they number less than half that of the Romans. Yet what they may lack in quantity, they more than make up for in experience. Among these ranks stand not poor young boys, but mature specialists, which include the Libyan Loncophori, the Iberian Caetrati, and the Balearic Sphedonitai. Most are armed with bundles of javelins and small round shields. Yet it is the last of these groups which would prove most formidable. Compared to the rest of the skirmishers, which largely relied on short-range weapons, these professional mercenaries wielded long-range slings capable of loosing lead bullets at speeds of over 100 kilometers an hour and ranges of up to 400 meters. Thus, as the two skirmishing bodies drifted close to one another, they were poised for an incredibly asymmetrical clash. But how exactly such fights occurred is left a mystery, as their details are rarely documented by our sources. We must imagine that these were rather fluid in nature. Each battle line, after all, was composed of a loose swarm, whose members would surge in and out of no man's land as packs or as individuals. To better conceptualize these dynamics, we can focus in on a small region of the front. Here, across a space no larger than a soccer field, are faced off 100 youths and 40 adults. Yet, unlike a friendly game, which might take place at the school sporting event, now both sides are armed with deadly weapons with no rules or referees to curb the violence. For the velites, this was reportedly a time to show one's courage in battle before comrades and superiors. Joining them on the front lines, we see what it might have looked like to step forth into the fray. Here we observe a mass of the enemy before us, just beyond the reach of our weapons. To strike them will require leaving the safety of our ranks. In a fit of courage, a young soldier might dash out to taunt the foe, dancing between incoming salvos, and toss their own javelin before pulling back. Others might more timidly emerge to collect spent weapons on the ground or pass them ahead to the more deserving. Likewise, the enemy does the same, though with greater strength and practiced accuracy. As this dance is repeated over the early hours of battle, we must imagine that rivalries would have formed as each group of skirmishers tested itself against the other across their slice of the battlefield. In areas where both sides are armed with javelins, perhaps there would have been a relative balance between the more numerous Roman youths and the more experienced Carthaginian adults. In other areas, perhaps a slight advantage was gained by one side or the other due to some particulars of the terrain, or as injuries and deaths began to take their toll on the morale of the participants. Yet now imagine what would have happened in areas where these same groups of javelin-armed velites were matched against the professional slingers of the Balearic Isles. Here, the youths would have been met with the ancient equivalent of gunfire, lead bullets fired at extreme range, with such force that it could pierce armor and such accuracy that it could reportedly target individual parts of the face. The ensuing carnage is left to our imagination. Of our two primary sources, Livy is mute on the matter, while Polybius merely remarks, quote, "The affair between these light-armed troops was indecisive." Clearly, this skips over the very real life-or-death struggles which transpired in the earliest hours of the Battle of Cannae. But, without further information, we must move on. At some points, the skirmishing phase was called off by the waving of banners and the blaring of trumpets. Likely this occurred as the last of the heavy infantry and cavalry had reached their designated places in the battle line. By now, it would have been close to midday, with the sun beating down on the sweating brows of over 120,000 idling soldiers. The heat and their nerves left them dripping with anticipation to get this over with. Soon, this wish would be granted by the commanders who deemed it time for the battle to begin in earnest. Our sources claim that it was Hannibal who made the first move, sending forth his 10,000 cavalry against the Roman flanks. This would have begun at a walk or slow trot so as to maintain stamina and unit cohesion. Thus crossing the roughly half-kilometre separating the armies would have taken around 3 to 5 minutes. For a better idea of what this may have looked like, we can zoom in, beginning on the western flank. Here, the hooves of 6,000 Gallic and Iberian horses kick up large plumes of dust into the air. It is an impressive force, whose sheer size has forced them to break out into multiple waves of assault and reserve units, just to squeeze into the narrow battlefield between the infantry and the river. When these units get closer to the Romans, the first of their ranks will begin to pick up speed. Officers shout encouragement to their squad mates, while steeds vocalize their own emotions to the herd. As momentum builds, each individual is now swept along in a growing avalanche, enveloped by deafening sound and blinding dust. To participate in such a charge must have been an incredible rush of adrenaline. The more than twice outnumbered ranks of the Equites have taken a defensive posture alongside the river.
Do not concern yourself with those Carthaginians yonder. Few will be honest sons of Carthage, if there is such a thing. Carthaginians, cowards all, pay others to die for them. Let us give them death.
Livy's account claims that around this time, the consul Paulus dismounted after being wounded by a slinger, leading many other Romans to do the same. Though this is not backed up by other sources, it does perhaps preserve some tradition of cavalry having chosen to fight on foot in an attempt to bolster their static position. Whatever the case, it seems clear that the Romans were indeed aware that they were doomed to be defeated on this flank. It was just a matter of delaying the inevitable as long as possible for the infantry to win the day. To get a true sense of things, we can drop down to the front lines. Here, the coming of the Carthaginians is heralded by rising dust clouds and the crescendo of hoofbeats. Soon, this is followed by the haunting appearance of a dark line rolling swiftly over the countryside. For a soldier in the center of formation, observing this horizon-spanning avalanche of flesh and iron will have shaken them to the core. The dire nature of Rome's predicament is only further reinforced as we zoom out to see that beyond this first wave of Carthaginians are two more great waves of death hurtling towards them. To make matters worse, we are told by Polybius that unlike typical cavalry engagements, quote, there was none of the usual formal advance and retreat, but when they once got to close quarters, they grappled man to man, and dismounting from their horses, fought on foot. In our model, we have depicted this as a literal smashing together of the front ranks. From a distance, this is relatively easy to conceptualize, as it aligns with the way such engagements are typically shown in games and movies. However, it proves far harder to imagine the realities on the ground. Here would have been a roughly 500-meter wide, rolling mass of man and beast. Unlike the infantry blocks, which can be expected to have some level of rigidity in their fighting, the cavalry were entirely more fluid, given the inherent nature of being mounted upon animals. In some cases, man and horse worked together to fight with some semblance of coordination. Other times, a rider was at the mercy of their steed's unpredictable motions. All the while, slashes, stabs, and javelin throws were being exchanged. Brute force even had its place as riders reportedly resorted to physically dragging each other off the saddle. On the ground would have been strewn the carnage of trampled men, crippled horses, spent weapons, and dismounted troops who now waded through the mayhem. Understandably, the fighting would have been brutal. Our sources claim that the Romans fought with great spirit and determination. However, the numerical odds were stacked heavily against them. It was only a matter of time before the crushing might of the Carthaginians broke through. But for now, let us pivot over to the eastern flank. Here we find an entirely different dynamic at play. On this front, the Carthaginians have deployed the 4,000 Numidian light cavalry. Specializing in hit-and-run tactics, these troops will have surged out towards the Roman line in nimble squadrons. Once in range, they then loosed their javelins before wheeling about. From the Roman perspective, this would not have been as immediately deadly as the brutal charge on the western flank, yet it was nonetheless extremely trying on the nerves. The refusal of the enemy to come to blows denied the Equites a chance to relieve stress through violence. Instead, they were subjected to an incessant needling. From a ground's eye view, we can see how unnerving this would have been. Yet, any attempts to break ranks and chase after the Numidians would have had the effect of chasing after a flock of birds. Lighter and faster, they simply darted out of the way and into the unknown dangers of the dust-shrouded ground beyond. Over-pursuing in such a situation would have tired out one's steed and potentially left Romans isolated. At this point, Numidian squadrons would have closed in to pick them off. Such tactics would have been enabled by the use of multiple self-reinforcing ranks of reserves, behind which skirmishers could rally and relieve one another. In this way might the fighting be dragged out for hours. Thus we see the highly dynamic nature of the eastern flank, which slowly but inexorably sapped the strength of the Romans. As the fighting on the flanks occurred, it was now the turn of the Romans to take the offensive by advancing their main body of heavy infantry. Once more, it should be emphasized that even such a seemingly simple maneuver was made complex by the sheer scale of the task at hand. After all, we are talking about coordinating the actions of 70,000 individuals across a roughly 2-kilometer wide front. For more on the matter, we can turn to historian Adrian Goldsworthy.
Once you've got your army in position, you also have to, once you're ready, decide to order it forward. We don't get any specifics about this. We assume that it's done by signal, in that you have trumpets blowing, standards perhaps moved, the commander's standard moved in a particular way, or maybe just the trumpet signal that is then taken up by trumpeters along the line and everybody goes. It's probably not as neat and everyone's stepping off at exactly the same time on the same foot sort of thing. Again, this is a big, inexperienced army, bigger than anything the Romans have ever known before, so nobody really knows how to do things. You're trying to modify your normal practices as little as possible to keep everybody understanding what's going on. In later periods, in the 1st century BC, we hear at Philippi, Brutus sends out dispatch riders to give the order to advance to all the different elements of his army, and as a result, various legions, each one goes when it gets the order and just heads off, so that the ones that are nearest to him get theirs first and start the attack first, and the others come in later. And clearly his staff of this fairly amateur Civil War army had not worked out that this was likely to happen. At Thapsus, one of Caesar's battles, where the advance begins without his instructions, Caesar was trying to stop them, and one cohort forces its trumpeter, its cornican, to signal the order to advance and starts going, and then the order is taken up, everybody repeats the signal and everybody goes, and Caesar is supposed to have said, all right, fair enough, get on with it, and attack. So even with the more professional armies of that period, admittedly in a civil war situation, you could get moments of confusion. So it's, again, we've got these nice digital figures representing our Roman soldiers, but remember, everybody's an individual, everybody's a human being, and this is not the most experienced Roman army around.
But if the start of an advance was already messy, the march itself proved even more so. This had much to do with the inherent variability of the participants, the terrain, and the conditions. For much of our model, we've been forced to simplify such variables. But in this section, we shall attempt to dial up the realism to give you a better idea of the real experience. Here, Dr. Goldsworthy shall once more be our guide.
As the Romans move forward, their formations will start to decay, at least to some extent. Important thing to remember is that even though Cannae is fought in what we consider to be a flat plain, in that there are no major terrain features recorded in our sources or obvious from the ground today, and that's true wherever it takes place, whichever of the theories is followed, that real landscapes, particularly farmland, are not like carefully mown football pitches or bowling greens or anything like that. This is real land, so it won't be perfectly flat. There will be little undulations, there'll be little humps and bumps. Because it's farmland, people have been using this. There's going to be tracks, there's going to be walls, there's going to be boundary stones. There are going to be perhaps hedges, trees, vines in places. We don't know what was being grown there at the time of the battle, but there could be animal pens, there could be drainage ditches. All of these things. And, people being very clear, farmers marking out, this is mine, this is yours, and that's the boundary you don't cross. So all of these things will mean that not everybody is going to be going at a perfectly steady, regular pace, straight forward. People will tend to veer a bit to the right, a bit to the left. Some groups will move faster than others. You get the very keen officer who's urging people forward, who always half anticipates goes too soon, the other who's a bit sluggish, who's a bit slower, a bit more cautious. So the little bits of the micro landscape, in a sense, that we can't represent, we've got no chance at all, even if we locate the battlefield, of knowing what this was, and would never appear in an account by a Polybius or a Livy or anyone like this, because it mattered to the dozen or so men who were marching along that bit of frontage, and those behind them. It doesn't matter to anybody else. Many people would never know it was there at all. There might be the odd building out there, the odd hut as well. Who knows what was there? Fences, anything, lots of things like this. So it's going to get messy fairly quickly. This is human nature. Added to the stress of all this, you are advancing towards an enemy that you can see and that is waiting to kill you, or perhaps soon coming forward to kill you. And even however keen you are, this is still, a pretty nervous moment for anyone. With all the excitement, the noise, the hubbub of all those people, and the sense of, again, being with this army is probably the time when you're seeing more human beings in any one place than you ever have before. When that army raises its battle cry, it's probably louder than anything you've heard in your life before, particularly for many of the Romans and the less experienced ones. So this is a very novel situation. As the Romans advance, there isn't a great deal that their officers can do. The consuls are off on the flanks. The centurions, 2 with each maniple in theory, 6 tribunes with a legion, they can influence the men immediately around them. Anyone who can hear their voice and then is willing to listen to it. It's mainly a question they can try and keep the pace steady. They can try and stop people from surging forward too quickly, breaking up formation even faster than it's going to happen. They can try and encourage them. They can try and cheer them. Polybius talks about the Roman lines, Roman troops regularly advancing, cheering and banging their weapons against their shields. So if you've got that sort of noise, then it's all the harder for officers to compete with that, for trumpet signals to compete with that. But again, think of the volume you might get from the crowd at a sporting event, the cheering, the chanting you can have. It's that sort of volume of noise. So the Romans can't do a lot apart from keep everybody moving forward, try and keep them in some sort of order and fairly steady, but they're not doing anything very, very clever. And there are limits, again, comes back to this dense formation that's going to be deteriorating even further. For anyone on horseback that gives them a bit of a viewpoint higher than everyone else, it's going to be hard to move around the battle line because there's not the space there would normally be between maniples, even in the approach to combat. So all of these things restrict what they can do, but they can certainly encourage each other and try and keep things reasonably steady. In contrast, the Carthaginian commanders have a more normal deployment. Hannibal, his brother Mago, who's there in the center of the line, they can ride around. They can ride between the units, they can ride up to them, they can encourage the men that they want to, as far as they can in terms of the ability to speak the languages of the different units involved. The Iberians in particular have been, serving for a long time under Hannibal and his family, so they're men he knows well, he probably can communicate with them. The Gauls have been with him for less than 2 years, but again, that's, a time to build up some sort of relationship. So they can do more, they can see more. Everybody's going to be a little bit confused. Between the two armies, you've got this large numbers of skirmishers fighting their own little battle. He can see what's going on there, probably better than the Romans can. Whether he contributes to this at all, or whether the skirmishers and the officers with them just do their job and they have supports organized and all that sort of thing, very hard to say. But Hannibal is in a better position than the Romans to see what's going on, but it is still quite difficult in a battle of this size for any one man to be somewhere where he can see all that's going on and be able to respond to it.
Eventually, after what likely took around 7 to 10 minutes of marching, the leading Roman infantry units would have come within striking range of the Carthaginians' Crescent formation. However, its echeloned nature further complicated the meeting of the two armies. Presumably, fighting would have begun among the most protruding units where Hannibal and his brother directly supervised the troops. Here, battle likely took place in the usual manner, with the Romans charging and launching their pila at the enemy. Likewise, the Gallic and Iberian infantry on the receiving end of the attack also charged at the last moment, with their own flurry of missiles. But what happened to either side of this first contact point? This is where things start to get even more confusing, with no clues offered from our sources. Thankfully, the true size nature of our model can offer some insight on the matter. One effect may have been that the Crescent blunted the force of the usual Roman assault. By echeloning units backwards, we see that as the Romans get close to the line of first contact, the Carthaginians are further and further away. By the time you reach the edges of the infantry, the gap is as large as 100 meters. For troops caught up in the momentum of the charge, resonating out from the center of the Crescent, having to cover this extra football field's worth of ground must have impacted their stamina and psychology. We know this was a serious issue to consider. At the Battle of Pharsalus, for instance, Caesar's troops actually stopped mid-charge to redress their lines when they observed the enemy was not advancing to meet them. On this occasion, the veteran troops were able to halt, reform, and re-engage for a more optimal fight. At Cannae, however, the Roman army was far greener and unlikely to have been able to pull off such a feat. Thus, the troops at the extremes of the line were likely faced with suboptimal conditions. With the extra distance to travel, did they now run and arrive exhausted? Did they throw their pila too early? Did they slow down and hesitate to engage? Unfortunately, we simply don't know. But, whatever occurred, the Crescent seems to have helped further delay and disorganize the infantry attack. A brilliant move on Hannibal's part to to counter Rome's greatest strength. But no matter how blunted the legion's charge may have been, the sheer weight behind the assault meant that it was only a matter of time before the Punic line began to cave in. We are told by our sources that this occurred in the centre. Here, Livy writes, quote, "This wedge was first driven back so far as to straighten the front, and then, continuing to yield, even left a hollow in the centre." Other sources back up the idea that the Carthaginian crescent was inverted over the course of the fighting, but how was this achieved? Polybius mentions the enemy giving ground, which serves as a convenient explanation. But military historians have thrown much doubt upon its feasibility. After all, pulling off such a complex maneuver was difficult enough on the parade ground, let alone in the thick of fighting. Even if one could perform such a thing, there is the problem of doing so over a significant distance without disintegrating into a rout. To better grasp this issue, we can simulate what bowing the line actually would have looked like from the ground level. As hundreds of meters fly by, you start to truly understand how great a distance this is. By the time you get to a 600-meter full back point, you are likely further away from the front than the two armies were from each other at the start of battle. Thus, no matter the mechanism of the retreat, it seems far more plausible to assume that any inverting of the crescent would have been far shallower than most diagrams would lead you to believe. That being said, we cannot definitely rule out a large retreat or even a breakthrough occurring. But for our model, we have assumed a shallow inversion. As for how this was achieved, a controlled retreat over such a small distance does start to seem more plausible, especially when we reimagine what extended infantry combat may have looked like. This is best explained by Dr. Goldsworthy himself.
We do know that the Romans start to push back the centre of Hannibal's line. They push back the crescent in the centre, perhaps break through it, at least at some point. How this occurs comes into all sorts of questions about just how ancient warfare, ancient infantry combat did actually develop, did actually happen. In the Hollywood image is everybody runs together, fights individual duels, and nearly everybody from which somebody dies in all of these things, and then somehow they know they've won or they haven't. Real life isn't like that. It's about groups. It's about units going forward, trying to inspire each other, officers trying to lead them. So it fits more with the model that people like Phil Sabin and I have developed, where you get bursts, pulses almost of combat, where because hand-to-hand combat is physically incredibly demanding and emotionally demanding, but it's physically hard work. Ask a fencer, martial artist, boxer, someone like that, how tired they get, even somebody as highly trained as that, after short bouts of combat. Then add in the weight of weapons and the stress that somebody's actually trying to kill you. Then you can't do this for 10 minutes, let alone hours on end. It will be short bouts of combat after which the two sides separate, perhaps only, the distance of 10 feet or so. That would make them safe, maybe even less. If you're outside the distance anyone can thrust a spear or stab with a sword, then unless they've got something to throw at you, you're safe. While you get your breath back, you get your enthusiasm back, and then you go forward again, renew the combat. So whether that's both sides step back, whether that's one side steps back, perhaps because it feels it's not quite so confident, not doing quite so well, you do get mentions in ancient battles of a side being pushed back a considerable distance without apparently breaking and running. So although that might be hard for us to imagine, within this context, that seems to be fairly typical of a lot of ancient infantry combat. You've got lots of Roman leaders encouraging them. You've also got Hannibal, Mago, other officers encouraging the Gauls, the Iberians to keep fighting. So it is presented as a very hard struggle. The Romans do not simply punch through the centre quickly. This takes time. And again, we can look at the overall casualty rate for Hannibal's army. It does seem very high for a victorious army, and the emphasis is that many of your leaders go. Now, they're not all falling at this stage, but it emphasizes how hard this fighting is.
But all of this action in the centre would have taken time. Meanwhile, the cavalry engagements, which had begun earlier, would have been reaching their climax. Our sources claim that the action peaked on the western flank first. Here we find that the rolling cavalry engagement has resulted in a ragged battle line. This would have been particularly true around the wings, as the more numerous Carthaginians attempted to outflank their prey. Along the river's edge, such affairs would have been complicated by the rushing waters and muddy banks. But certainly there would have been some messy fighting across such contested ground. Across the opposite side of the cavalry brawl, the open fields would have presented better opportunities for manoeuvre. Here we can imagine that cavalrymen tentatively made their way through the dust clouds, feeling out the edges of the foe's formation. Away from the pack, more isolated and fluid fighting could have occurred between individuals or small groups. Crucially, Carthage's advantage of reserves would have more easily allowed them to exploit any vulnerabilities which developed. Eventually, the pressures along the front and especially the envelopment around the flanks would have cracked Rome's morale. First as a trickle, then as a deluge. Riders broke away from the fighting, fleeing for their lives. With cavalry, such an affair would have happened even faster than a rout amongst infantry. Adrenaline-fueled mounts now made for the countryside, perhaps hoping to make safe at the camps to the rear. Others, such as Consul Paulus in the case of Polybius's account, even attempted to rejoin the infantry. But Carthage was in hot pursuit. As avenues of retreat were cut off, it is likely that many desperate Romans made way for the river. Such a sight must have been incredible to behold, as hundreds of troops now spilled into the shallow waters. If our sources are to be trusted, few made it across alive. Certainly, many Carthaginian squadrons kept up the pursuit to drive the victory home. However, their commander Hasdrubal acted with great skill and discretion by reining in many of his troops for a charge across to the other side of battle. Such restraint is incredibly rare in ancient battles, especially in the chaos of a pursuit. However, our model shows that this action was likely made far more practical by the use of reserves who may well have been kept detached for this very moment. Now, such troops could have easily wheeled into columns for an efficient transit across the battlefield. Viewed from the rear of the Roman infantry, this decisive action might have been glimpsed as an ominous billowing of dust clouds moving against the wind. Meanwhile, on the eastern flank, the indecisive fighting between the Numidians and the Roman allies raged on. Yet, amidst the indecisive fighting, a turning of the tides may have been sensed by the observation of dust clouds from the west. The final revelation that these were enemy reinforcements would have been swift, as their columns now fanned out to envelop the pinned foe. This pending disaster led to an immediate collapse of the Roman position. Just as had occurred in the west, the eastern flank now disintegrated. From above, we can see this destruction of the cavalry elements. Once more, Hasdrubal shows great command by sending off the Numidians in pursuit, while he himself rallies the remainder of the cavalry to strike at the exposed rear of the enemy's centre. But this all will have taken precious time. Meanwhile, as we return to the fight in the centre, we see that the nature of the fight has evolved. The first major change is that the Romans have pushed back, if not partially broken through, the Carthaginian centre. The second change is that in the process of doing so, their formation has lost all cohesion. On the ground level, we can see why this might be the case. Here, individual soldiers at the front have shifted around in the process of fighting or rotating in and out of combat. Meanwhile, units further to the rear have also lost order as they slowly advance with the front lines or naturally expand to fill gaps in the formation. This has had the effect of turning them into a wholly unmanageable mob. But for now, such a state proves viable enough to still bully their way through the Carthaginian ranks, which is only a few dozen meters deep. As they do so, we are told by our sources that the Libyans on the wings now swing in to strike them from the flanks. However, looking at our model, it is difficult to understand how exactly this will have worked. One option would have been to simply turn to the side and attack the units next to them. But this assumes that there was an exposed flank to strike at, with no friendly forces in the way. Another option would have been for the Libyans to commit to a grander maneuver, walking nearly a kilometre to reach a breakthrough in the centre or to wrap around the Roman rear. Either of these would have taken a considerable amount of time and control to execute. We shall let Dr. Goldsworthy shed light on the matter.
Cannae does seem to be unique in the way the Libyans function. There are sometimes troops kept back to be committed later, and of course at Zama he'll have 3 lines mirroring the Roman deployment, but they're not doing the same sort of manoeuvring that these Libyans do at Cannae. The deployment, though, is fundamentally unusual because you've had these Libyan troops, the pick of your troops, in reserve. For most armies, reserves aren't really a big feature of what they do. I mean, the Romans have them, the standard triplex acies, 3 lines, though again you could see this more as waves rather than as true reserves. Only in a few battles and only later do we hear about sections of a second or third line being taken off to do something else. So Cynocephali, for instance, where maniples in the rear are taken off to deal with the collapse of the Roman left flank. So again, it comes back to that sense that Cannae is a unique situation. The tactics there are not part of some long-term plan that Hamilcar and then Hannibal have been toying with over the decades and trying to perfect. But it's actually something that Hannibal has come up with for this situation and facing this particular Roman army. So it meets the tactical requirements of this particular problem. A much bigger Roman army, loads of infantry, and maybe it also has some sense of what the battlefield is like, what space there is that I can do this. It's very vague, but there are lots of ways it could be happening, and we probably oversimplify because, again, we rush through the tactic and we want it to happen really quickly. We also tend to assume that the battle is a fluid, constant thing without lulls in the fighting, without delays. Even in this breakthrough that the Romans have come forward, there are some units still standing up against them, at least holding them a little way, and the Romans hesitate, rest, get their breath back, come forward again and attack. All the attacks later on will tend to consist more of hand-to-hand combat because as the battle continues, those men with missiles have probably thrown them. So you might have light infantry supporting them, but in the main, you're having to get the energy, the motivation, the enthusiasm to charge forward again, fight hand to hand and hope the enemy breaks. So there's a lot more slog and attrition. Even with this Roman success, we probably are wrong to think of it as happening really quickly and everybody rushing through and then the Libyans somehow running a 4-minute mile or so to get up to in neat formation to hit the Romans in the flank and trap them. The whole thing is probably a lot more gradual than we tend to imagine, and it may happen unit by unit rather than each wing of Libyans doing everything at the same time.
But however it happened, it seems that the commitment of the Libyans helped further stall the Roman advance, which had been on the precipice of a substantial breakthrough. Perhaps, even at this late juncture, the legions may yet have had the strength to press on. Yet, this is when Hannibal's cavalry finally returned to the fight. Joining them may well have been the Punic skirmishers, who go unmentioned by our sources. If it was indeed Hannibal's ultimate plan to strike a decisive blow to the rear, it makes sense for at least some of these units to have wrapped around the flanks to assist them on this mission. But even still, with cavalry and skirmishers at the rear, there was a nearly 2-kilometer wide stretch of open ground for them to somehow cover. The scales involved are made clear in our model and force us to contemplate how this might actually have happened. Once more, Dr. Goldsworthy will guide us through this thought exercise.
So you've got your mass of legionaries, mostly the heavy infantry, Hastati, Principes, Triarii in particular at the back. But you've also got the velites. Where have they gone? They've pulled back, particularly if they've used their missiles. So you're adding in lots of other people into this mass of a crowd. And again, under normal circumstances, the heavy infantry could turn round, form up, charge and drive off the light infantry. They probably won't catch them, but they can keep them at some sort of distance. But you can't do that if there's lots of cavalry there, because then your formation is going to break up, you're going to be vulnerable to the flanks. As you charge forward, you'll tend to scatter. It's the sort of thing that happened at Carrhae in the 1st century BC, where you can try and drive the enemy off, but then you end up as a knot of infantrymen that's either going to be shot by missiles, hit by missiles that are thrown, charged in the flank, charged in the rear. So that combination of cavalry and light infantry, which we can guess might be coming in, closing in on the Roman rear, is a very formidable one in these circumstances, because the Romans are not an organized battle line anymore. Again, this is something the model shows well, because you can get a sense of how much area these cavalry could occupy, particularly, again, think of them as groups, troop sizes, squadron sizes, 50, 100, 200 or so. Lots of groups rather than 1 or 2 big blocks, supported by light infantry that can form up with some supports, but also with most going forward as a skirmish line. And they can move. They're not static. They can charge in, they can pull back, they can charge again. So you're being worn down and it's sapping the strength. The probability is, though, and clearly the figures afterwards show, that some Romans, substantial numbers of them, do break out of this encirclement, which again comes back to this idea it's a very wide area behind the Roman formation, and the cavalry don't seal it off completely. Some knots of men will break out, probably to be amongst the ones that surrender in the camps afterwards, and some of the survivors, people like Scipio Africanus, they get out somehow or other. So it's never completely sealed, but it's very difficult and dangerous to get out in only small numbers, and they will do so only if they're very determined to stick together and fight their way out, not fight their way to sort of stabilize the line.
Thus, we now arrive at the end of tactical maneuvers of the battle. All troops have been committed and their fates sealed by the hours' worth of grappling between the two great wrestling armies. The end result is that the Roman army has been pinned such that any observing referee would call an end to the match. But in war, there is no such arbiter. So, what can history tell us about the fate of armies caught in similar predicaments?
Now, armies have got trapped and surrounded before in other battles on smaller scales, and they've been sometimes shot down from a distance. Think of the Spartans on Sphacteria. Much smaller action, but nevertheless gives you an idea of how a more numerous, more maneuverable group can take out heavy infantry. There have been these disasters. There have been mass slaughters in particularly some of Alexander's victories over the Persians, where at Issus, at Gaugamela, even think of the Greek mercenary infantry and the other Persian infantry at the Battle of the Granicus, where they effectively get abandoned by their cavalry that's been driven off, they get surrounded and they're wiped out. 2,000 are taken prisoner, allowed to surrender and sent back in chains to slave in the mines, but the rest are just slaughtered. Now, Alexander loses a horse while he's leading. There is still fighting going on, but it is very one-sided. The casualties are overwhelmingly suffered by the beaten army, by the mercenaries and the other Persian troops, how many there are there. So these sorts of things have happened, but never quite as deliberately as at Cannae.
As Dr. Goldsworthy suggests, there is indeed a uniqueness to the nightmare at Cannae which ensued. We can drop down to the point of view of a Roman soldier for perspective. Ancient authors shed some light on the matter with brutal anecdotes of trapped soldiers so tightly packed that they could no longer lift their weapons to defend themselves, while others buried their heads in the sand to hasten their own demise. On top of this, we must add the undocumented toll that heat, exhaustion, and deadly crowd surges must have had on the mob of Romans caught in the ever-tightening vice grip of the Carthaginians. Yet, even with all the attrition they had endured so far, the legions still represented a body of troops far more numerous than the Carthaginians who surrounded them. This posed a unique logistical problem for Hannibal's men on how to actually dispose of their trapped foe.
What you have to remember is that the 50,000 or so Romans and Italians that die in this phase of the battle have to be killed at very short range by muscle-powered weapons. Some of them can be shot down by sling bullets, they can be hit by thrown javelins, other missiles. But most, you're going to have to go forward and within arm's length, within that distance, kill them with sword, with spear, with any other weapons. The story of Cannae is one of great tactical subtlety, skill, but also of extreme brutality. This is a very nasty encounter. This level of slaughter in this area is probably amongst the most vicious and costly of all ancient battles, focused in such an area. The pursuits after Alexander's victories tend to be spread out over a little bit longer, though you still get the nightmarish stories of sort of bridging the Issus with corpses, much as you'll get the stories of the Aphidius being bridged with corpses. There's this theme. There is a sense, yes, a lot of the sources from Livy, Appy and the like get a bit carried away, but the nightmarish element probably is a reasonable reflection of just what this was like. You have to be killed close up, and it has to be done by muscle power, and those Romans don't just die, though they are again suffering far heavier losses because they're not an organized fighting line. They're just masses of desperate, terrified men, some of them fighting to the end, some of them perhaps giving in, but all having to be killed one by one. This is probably lasting hours to kill all these people, because the Carthaginians are not machines. They can't keep fighting. They've got to rest and then go forward again. And every time that's going to be harder. Their swords will be blunted. We have the grim statement attributed to Hannibal that at Zama he thought his front two lines would take the edge off the Roman swords and weapons before they reached his veterans who could show them. But that is actually true. The edges on these things, all of this is driven by muscle power. The more they strike into flesh, into bone, into muscle, the more they strike armor, the blunted they're going to get, and the harder it will be to drive them home. So it's grim, it's appalling, it's very gruesome, but that's the nightmare of Cannae, is this mass slaughter.
By the time the sun began to set on the battlefield, the final tally of destruction was staggering. Over 50,000 men lay dead or dying in an area little more than a few square kilometers across. More than half the Roman army had fallen, including a consul, 2 proconsuls, 29 military tribunes, 30 senators, 300 nobles, and many more souls, whom the history books do not tally. Even Hannibal suffered losses as high as 8,000, or roughly 16%, an exceptionally deadly percentage for a victorious army. To this day, Cannae remains one of the bloodiest single-day battles in history. The fallout from this event is best covered in another video. For now, we will bring our own discussion to an end. Looking back on this exercise of modelling Cannae in true size, we hope that it has given you a better understanding of what happened on that day. Both from the perspective of how ancient armies deploy, maneuver, and fight, but also from the perspective of the individuals involved, whose human experience should not be overlooked, and whose understanding is vital for properly bringing the past to life. A huge thanks again to Dr. Goldsworthy for helping develop this detailed model of Cannae and for coming on as a speaker in this series. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us on Patreon to participate in polls, catch script previews, and get HD downloads of all our art. We owe a huge debt to our current patrons for funding the channel and to our researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without this team and this community. So, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.